This is Grounded, a climate startup journey. A quick note that you'll probably want to listen to this series in order. It's not really one of those interactive, choose-your-own-adventure type situations. So if you're new here, welcome. And I'd gently suggest that you start with episode 1, where this whole silly idea began. Otherwise, let's get started. Last time, you left me in a machine-shaped pickle. After weeks of searching for a biochar making machine, I'd become pretty convinced that a batch system was the only sensible approach for my small-scale pilot. But I'd also become increasingly concerned that this type of machine wouldn't allow me to produce carbon removal credits. And that was all thanks to standards. Honestly, everything was getting a bit overwhelming. This felt existential. The whole point had been to build a business that could remove carbon from the atmosphere. And pretty crucial to the word business in that sentence was getting paid for it.
Can't you just go plant some trees?
Oh, God. Then you'd have to wait 30 years before you'd see any actual carbon removal. Maybe we should set up a direct air capture company instead.
Well, how much does one of those machines cost?
Oh, that's going to be tens of millions at this point in time.
Yeah, so maybe not.
Sounds like I'd be sticking to biochar for now. But as anybody who's tried to set up a business before will know, you can't exactly deal with obstacles one at a time as they arise. While I was juggling the question of the machine and negotiating the tricky issue of standards, I was also doing my best to just keep things moving in other ways. Taking trips to the farm in Cornwall, meeting potential feedstock suppliers, and otherwise trying to work out how I was going to do this whole damn thing. One of the simplest, but most symbolically significant things that I'd done over the Christmas holidays was to meet a promise I'd made to myself back in the summer, to incorporate a business before the end of 2023. Admittedly, I hadn't pictured doing this amidst the festive chaos.
What's the address of the Kenner? So I'm registering the business to that.
Oh no, you're not there.
Yeah,
I don't want the letters turning up.
you don't really get any letters.
It wasn't the glamorous surroundings I'd imagined for this momentous occasion, but at least I was surrounded by people who kept me grounded. Pun intended. And it felt like a big step.
Yeah, okay, 1 second. I'm just incorporating a business. Application submitted.
What for?
The biochar company.
Well, what are you called?
Restored.
Restore.
Restored without the E
What?
at the end.
Restored.
No, restored.
Redo.
Yes.
Well, we're called that, are we? Am I involved in the company?
If you'd like to be involved.
I thought it worked. I was trying to restore the health of the planet and store carbon in the soil after all. And are you really a millennial with a startup if you don't drop a letter from your company's name? Even if you have to carefully spell out your new email address to your own parents. I'd also started working on the podcast of it all, the thing that you're listening to right now. It had always been the plan not only to use this as a big learning opportunity for me, but to open source that learning for others. Leave a bit of a legacy for future would-be biochar producers or climate founders. So by this point, I was recording most of my waking moments, some of which you've now heard, and the rest of which are still clogging up my producer's hard drive. Sorry, not sorry, Ben. This is all to say that I really felt like I'd sunk increasing amounts of time, money, and reputation into this project. Sure, I hadn't bought a machine, but I'd now been living without a wage for many weeks, had been zigzagging across the country in my electric car, and had told just about everyone I met that I was setting up a business, including people who'd kindly given a lot of their time to speak to me. And the podcast itself was also holding me to account in a way. This was meant to be a how-to rather than a how not to, and I wasn't ready for that story to end here. So, I kept going. I was now convinced that the only realistic and sensible approach for this particular pilot was a batch system, and CapChar's machine and team were the best fit that I'd come across. The problem was, as things stood, I didn't think I'd be able to produce carbon removal credits if I chose this route. But talking to CapChar, I was realising that this wasn't just a problem I wanted to solve. They also needed to solve it if they were going to build a successful business. Because everybody interested in their machines would be coming up against exactly the same hurdles as I was. and it was something they were already spending a lot of time thinking about.
The testing we've done with, so that's the H-Corg ratio, the hydrogen to organic carbon ratio. A lot of the standards talk about it needs to be somewhere less than 0.7, some say 0.4. Our testing that we've done through labs has come out less than both of those figures, and that's a sign of permanence over 100 years.
The actual biochar that CapChar's setup was producing was well within the bounds outlined by leading standards. It was proper, durable carbon removal that they could evidence. My bigger concerns were around the process itself, in particular emissions and heat recovery. When it comes to gas emissions, those syn gases I mentioned in the last episode, some degree of this was going to be inevitable. And this is where I think biochar may have a bit of an image problem. I mean, as we all know, burning things is generally not a great thing for the atmosphere, and any talk of emissions or releasing gases is gonna attract legitimate scrutiny. The difference here is that A, you're using this process to store a lot of carbon that would be released if that biomass burned naturally or decomposed, and B, you're going to work your socks off to reduce the negative impacts associated with this process. This is something I feel really passionately about. It's so important to frame this conversation around the fact that almost no process is completely clean. But carbon removal, including biochar, remains the only process that can achieve net negative CO2 emissions. Essentially, you have to do a bit of ugly to do a lot of good. Ignore the ugly? No, but don't let it stop you doing the good. For instance, one gas you're going to release if you make biochar is CO2. Ironic, sure, but as I say, far more of that carbon dioxide would be heading for the atmosphere if you didn't make this biochar. Obviously, you want more of that carbon locked in your biochar and less of it heading into the atmosphere, and this will largely depend on factors like your burn temperature and your feedstock, but you can think of any you release as part of the pyrolysis process as basically the carbon you weren't able to capture, and the details aren't so important from a standards perspective. Then there's methane, which is a bigger issue. As you'll probably know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, so you really want to reduce the methane that you're sending up into the atmosphere. Biochar production isn't unique in this regard. Even composting will produce some methane, but you still want to minimize it. One way to do this is gas flaring. And when you burn methane, you get H2O, or water vapor, and CO2, for which, see above. In theory, flaring is a pretty easy process. You just set fire to some gas. The tricky part, I learned, is working out when you're releasing methane, so that you can start flaring it. And in terms of the gas coming off then, you have to burn the methane off or flare it or whatever, or somehow cycle it back in.
Exactly. So the general principle is when the kiln is getting to 200, you've essentially got steam and super steam, and you're starting to get off some of the volatiles. So you'll have a bit of carbon monoxide, you'll have methane, you'll have hydrogen, and that's when you switch them over. And that's why, sure, if you've got a really fancy kiln, it will do all that stuff for you and work out what's in the gas stream. We don't have that luxury. So ours is about working out when the temperature is at. We switch the valves off, and then we drive it through, and then it'll be burnt off. When you do the flaring, yes, of course, you'll have like 5 seconds of some of the syngas escaping to atmosphere before you literally light it with a blowtorch, and that's it. And so you get a relatively clean burn.
Okay.
And we've also got a project in the pipeline with somebody who might be interested in working on cleaning up the stack. But again, it's another project that requires funding. So
there's some cool stuff.
One of the key things about CapChar that really drew me to them was this can-do attitude and the commitment to continuously improving their method. As Adam says, they've overcome the first hurdle that a smaller, more affordable pyrolysis unit faces, of identifying when to start flaring your gases. But they're now working to see how they can mop up even more of the methane. The same was true of my second big concern, heat recovery.
You can see this is a journey, right?
And so your next question, if we were to wrap a coil around the flue stack and do heat recovery.
That's exactly what we're doing in
Yeah,
Wales.
that's exactly what we're doing in Wales.
Around the time I was talking with CapChar, they were also in the early stages of another biochar project in Wales. Things were getting pretty busy for CapChar.
Yeah, so I think we're going to do a hot water heat exchanger around the flue. We're going to run that into a domestic heating tank. And then off that, we'll then build essentially an underfloor heating system, which will go under our composter, which is what we're doing for Wales. But obviously with yourself and many of the sites and people that we talk to, they're going to want that underfloor heating system to go underneath the next stack of wood that's going to go into the next burn, so that therefore it can be a lot quicker.
Now, strictly speaking, this method of heat recovery might not meet the thresholds of some of these standards, but in practical terms, it was a very strong start, particularly for a smaller, more affordable batch system. That heat could either be directed to warm buildings that would otherwise be heated from other energy sources, or, as I was more interested in, to dry my biomass and reduce the energy needed to get it pyrolyzed, and potentially reduce the amount of syngases. I was gradually coming to the conclusion that if machines like Capchar's weren't able to mint carbon credits, then it didn't seem realistic for any small-scale biochar producers to do so in the UK, or in other countries that faced similar hurdles. Certainly not without major investment and in a way that made financial sense. And if that wasn't able to happen, I felt we were really missing a trick. Missing out on the opportunity that so many people I'd spoken to, Rob Palmer, Mick and Darren Jones, Adam and Chintan themselves, had all identified. So again, it really all came back to getting those standards. Interestingly, Adam and Chintan had a plan.
Current global standards available have been designed with industrial production in mind, and for the UK biochar market to actually scale, we need a certification standard for farm scale production rather than large scale production.
So Capchar decided to go down the path of creating its own code.
Capchar's approach to their machine had been, if you don't see it, build it. And they were now aiming to do exactly the same thing with the standard. This standard would be designed around the particular context for biochar production in the UK. At the time we spoke, they were busy working on this and hoping to launch it for public consultation in the summer. This was the first thing in weeks that had given a sense of how we might do this. And it felt exciting, because if you're trying to disrupt the space and clear the path for others, what better way than to be among the first to pilot a new standard that might bring more producers into the space?
Does it have to be approved by some sort of government body or some sort of third party to make it sort of legitimate? If I just announce I've got a standard, then what the hell does that mean?
Of course, standards aren't laws. They're something you sign up to voluntarily. A bit like if you grow bananas and you want to certify that they're organic or fair trade. But unlike non-organic bananas, non-certified carbon removal credits are going to be pretty much impossible to sell if you want to sell them on a marketplace, like the one that I used to work at. So yes, anybody can write a standard, but you want that standard to be something the industry will trust. And the challenge in the long term will be getting this standard recognised by independent bodies, such as the ICVCM or ICROA, from which marketplaces will then take their lead. And this ain't easy. You need to know that your work is credible and prove that it's backed by evidence. And what's more, it can take years. So Capchar's work on a standard gave me hope that minting credits would be possible in the short term. But this could still be a bumpy road. In the meantime, I dug into some of the other standards to see if there were any stones left unturned. I sat down to speak with Nicholas Volgemuth from Carbon Future, a carbon removal marketplace that puts a huge emphasis on trust. For them, sourcing projects certified by leading standards such as Puro or the EBC, European Biochar Certificate, is the goal.
We're facing a situation at the moment where we're just trying to figure out what's the best standard to go for, because from what I gather, having spoken over email with the EBC, that machine, although we're looking at a heat recovery method, like that machine isn't going to pass, basically.
To receive this EBC certificate, you're completely right that 70% of the waste heat need to be used.
But could there be a workaround?
With the exception that you, of course, can apply for a exempt of this methodology, probably with the argument that you're in a scale-up phase and you are looking for a more high-tech equipment within the next, 2 years or so. From the history, I know that the EBC has permitted that. I don't know whether they still do
with
this,
EBC,
but this
I
is-
might
this is
have a
the
way
way
in
to
after all, if I emphasise that this was a pilot project, giving me time to work on the process. What about Puro, my original choice. For this, my big concern had been around the size of projects they considered.
Because they are looking for projects of at least 1,000 or 1,500 tons per year. Puro as a standard is wanting to get less involved into the work with the projects directly. That's why they agree with entities like Carbon Future to support them as project developer. There is actually no volume threshold if you go through a project developer, so you can theoretically also apply through Carbon Future with Puro. But about the batch system and the technicalities there, I would need to dig into the methodology again. We have very few projects working on batch systems so far.
In this case, it would be about teaming up with a so-called project developer, and an organization like Carbon Future might be a good option here. Again, it wasn't a surefire solution, but it was an opening. Nikolaus ran through a few other options with me regarding other standards.
What's also possible theoretically is...
And in each case, it seemed like there might just be a possible path ahead. Every route individually was far from certain, but taken together, it felt like something could work. If I'd only had one of these options open to me, it would have felt like too big a risk. But with the work that Capchar were doing, and the insights I'd had from Nikolaus about some of the existing standards, I felt like I could move ahead. Crucially, I didn't need to pick a certifier until I started getting round to producing biochar, which gave me a few months to continue learning and getting things sorted. And all intricacies aside, I felt that Capchar had my back on this. We both wanted to produce biochar and remove CO2, and we both wanted to ensure that there was a business model that worked. It felt like I just might be ready to commit. I went to Oxford to see Adam and Chintan and hash out some of the details. It was a moody spring sort of day, when the temperature is far colder than it should be for that time of year. Grey skies, a bit menacing really. We met at a cafe on the corner of the train station.
It all started on an ordinary day, in the most ordinary place in the world, the refreshment room at Milford Junction.
Although we'd spoken a lot about the machine, the standards, the biochar, and the technical side of things, we still hadn't gone deep on what the relationship might look like. What relationship, I hear you ask? And yes, that's fair enough. My initial plan was just to buy a machine and run with it. Thank you, biochar machine maker, I've got it from here.
And then he walked away out of my life forever.
But from my early conversations with Capchar, it was clear that this wouldn't be a straightforward, I buy a machine, say bye-bye to Capchar situation. For starters, as I've said, I was an early customer for Capchar, and that meant they already had a particular interest in my project and its success. Secondly, they were working on their standard, which I might well be using, so there'd likely be some collaboration there. And thirdly, alongside the machine, Capchar could supply a lot of the technical infrastructure to get the actual credits. You might remember Chintan spoke last time about their background in software. Well, it had always been a big part of their ambition, beyond the machine itself, to build this infrastructure that allows credits to be created and registered. I'll go into more detail on this another time, because you've already heard me drone on about methane. Anyway, there was complexity here that needed to be defined. And the more we spoke, I realised that Capchar didn't just want to be a supplier, they wanted to be a partner.
So the way that I'm seeing it is your business model is panning out in such a way that like part owning the machine is a big piece of that puzzle, and then at the same time obviously having the minting side of things through your registry that will hopefully be made.
If we can find a way to split the 70 that we're happy with, if we want to do that 50-50, I think that's, what is that, 9, let's just say roughly 9.
Yeah.
So maybe that's
So
the answer you wanted from today.
Yeah, it's maybe not necessarily what I wasn't sure what to expect when I was coming into this chat, so it's not an outcome I expected necessarily for us to be going down that route, but also at the same time it feels like a potentially
well, and
good
also
one.
we weren't sure that you had the funding to do, because it's quite a lot of funding to, you know, especially when you've not got a job. Obviously you've got expenses, so we were kind of like, not that wasn't even in your remit either.
Thanks, Chintan. But fair enough. I really didn't have a job. And maybe I didn't seem like as credible a pyrolysis machine buyer as I liked to think. Basically, for this pilot project and the first machine, their proposal was this. My company, Restored, and Adam and Chintan's, Capchar, would go down a 50-50 machine ownership model. That started by splitting the deposit. While that wasn't what I'd initially envisioned, this was one obvious benefit. I'd only have to stump up half the initial cash. Beyond that, I realised that it might also allow us to dovetail our skills and resources pretty nicely. As Restored, I would be bringing the labour, location, supply chain, biochar delivery and credit sales. As Capchar, they would provide the tech behind the machine itself, the software data collection system, biochar code, third-party LCA audit service, and a registry to mint the carbon credits produced. Again, rest assured, if this is nonsense to you, as it was once for me, I can come back to it later on. Essentially, they're the infrastructure, we're the delivery partner, and they'd be on hand to help at various stages throughout the process, which also felt like it mitigated a lot of my risk.
But you see, some of the things you've got to think about, the reason for doing that is because in the future, we will have an engineering team. So when that machine goes down, someone's got to fix it. So either you or your staff would have to do that, or that's part of our reason for being vested. Because if we're vested and that goes down, no one's making any money.
And if you get to the point where you go, actually, this machine is only making half what I can make, how can I make this project get bigger? And we go, right, well, actually, we've got this other piece of technology, so let's swap it out. That can go to another new project.
In fact, Adam would likely come down to Cornwall with me for the first week or two of biochar making, to help me get things going and iron out any process issues early on. It's worth saying that this isn't a typical relationship. None of the other machine producers I'd spoken to had suggested anything along these lines. So yeah, it took me a minute to wrap my head around. But the more I reflected on it, the more I realised that other industries had precedents for this. Take solar power. Collaborations like this between the technology provider and the solar farm operator are pretty common. I did have some wariness. We were moving from the casual dating to the commitment stage. And with it would come all the messy stuff they skip over in the rom-coms. The who does the dishes when we've both been working late, or the whose parents do we spend the holidays with this year. No doubt, it would be a learning curve. But it felt like we were inventing something that could work for us, at least for now. And the thing that really excited me, compared to all those other machines that I'd been looking at with multi-year wait times, they thought we could start producing biochar and credits pretty quickly.
Do you think with everything you've got going on that we'll be in a position, if we run the project and make the biochar, sell the credits, to actually be able to mint them by the end of the year?
Yeah.
By the end of this year, for sure, yeah.
For sure. We have our software already done. It's just over there waiting for a project now to do them, because it's chicken and egg.
On the way home from Oxford, my mind turned to my vision. Not my eyesight, which is 20/20. I mean the vision that I had for this project down the line. In the early days of a startup, I've realised it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day problems that need to be solved, hurdles that need to be overcome, and small wins and losses that can make up each week. And in this podcast, I've attempted to share what this time has been like for me. I'd always known that this wasn't going to be an overnight success. Removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere isn't something that you do because you want to get rich tomorrow. And that's all fine. You don't do this if you're not mission-driven. And for me, I knew the moment that I held that first bit of biochar in my hand would be an incredible high, even if it was just the first step. What this all meant for me is that I was beginning to sketch out what the next 6 to 12 months would look like. I'd be setting up a pilot project down in Cornwall with Capchar's machine. I'd be making a few tons of biochar and sequestering a few tons of carbon each month. And to keep my overheads down, I'd be doing much of this work myself, both the business development side, like building relationships with farmers and feedstock suppliers, and the literal physical shoveling of feedstock and biochar. But beyond this, things were a lot more hazy. And that was a good thing, because I'd be using these months to find my way.
It's abundantly clear that Capchar know what they're talking about when it comes to producing biochar for carbon removal purposes. The way I see it, at least, it's very much we partner together on this project and run this pilot scheme, and we're both very involved and invested. but there's nothing committing us to working on future projects together.
Well, it has to make sense commercially for both of you to continue a relationship past the pilot stage, I guess.
Yeah, which is what we'd hopefully figure out during the pilot, is like what actually is the commercial viability here.
Here's a fact I haven't yet mentioned, but it's actually quite important. And if you're business-minded, this may be the moment that you throw your phone at the wall and wonder what the hell I've gotten myself into. For this particular pilot, with one machine, there's actually no way I could make enough money from biochar and credit sales for this to make financial sense. First-year sales wouldn't even cover my time on this, never mind anyone else's or paying for the capital on the machine. And I'd known this all along. The reason for doing this pilot wasn't to make money. It was to build relationships, knowledge, partnerships, to start small and prove whether it's possible to do this in the UK. Of course, eventually, yes, I'd need this to be commercially viable, and Adam and Chinton had been totally open about this from day one, if I grew with them.
Technology, as I said at the start, has to really be at the ton scale.
Yeah.
So you need 5 of these things
Yeah.
to then start making it work, to have the labour piece,
Yeah.
to have enough char and do all the volume
Makes
efficiencies.
sense. Makes sense.
What I did know is that in the long run, I wanted to do big scale carbon removal. Would this look like a scaled up version of what I was currently doing? CapChar's machines in a decentralized way, a network of farm scale operations? Or would it look different? I didn't know. All I did know is that I was going to learn on the job and see what happened from there. And I hoped it would be equally valuable for CapChar. So a couple of weeks later, I logged into my online banking and finally put my money down.
Okay. Pay and transfer. Are you sure you want to send £9,000? Yes. Payment done. Oh my god. Didn't think the biggest pain in my life would be going on a pyrolysis machine. Wow. Hang on, your beer.
There was no time for a beer. Not to mention every penny now mattered. Goodbye savings, goodbye redundancy buffer. Hello OnlyFans? But yeah, reality check, this was now officially happening, and I needed to get some serious cash flow. Then I remembered Rob Palmer's words, start small.
Start small.
So I looked around myself to see where and how I could get the ball rolling.
I'm the chair of the executive committee,
The chair of the executive committee. A very grand title.
Very grand. I love saying it.
For a few months now, I've been a member of a group called the Future Leaders Network. The FLN, it's hosted by an organisation called CORE. You're hearing my chat with Francesca, whose impressive title I know I wouldn't be forgetting.
CORE forms part of a £30 million grant that was made by UKRI, the UK's kind of research and innovation funding body, to GGR research projects, and that was in 2021.
GGR stands for greenhouse gas removal, essentially an umbrella term that includes carbon dioxide removal and other similar interventions.
So that grant involves funding 5 so-called demonstrator projects, all looking at early stage versions of different types of GGR methods. And CORE kind of sits at the centre of those projects and helps to connect and provide that sort of integrating work that needs doing.
But the FLN is a newer initiative of CORE to support collaboration and networking across the space, in particular for people who are at the early stages of their carbon removal journey. Ring a bell?
We see that sector as being pretty unique in the sense that it's one that needs to grow very, very quickly. And that means that we need a huge pipeline of talent coming into the sector. We need ideas, we need expertise. And so the FLN exists to kind of develop that pipeline. It shouldn't be a radical idea, but kind of building human connection, learning about your peers on a personal level, then becoming kind of allies and collaborators in a shared goal is really important. I think it's also about kind of understanding that you're not necessarily Tom from the Carbon Removal Show. I'm not necessarily Francesca from the FLN, but we are kind of individuals that hopefully will be working in the sector for a long time, and we want to make sure that we have kind of shared goals, shared understanding as we hope to deliver that important impact.
When you're navigating an industry as a wannabe entrepreneur, networks are really important. And in the time I'd been part of the FLN, I'd already benefited from online talks to in-person events, socials like bowling and pool, and new introductions that were helping me learn and think in new ways about my business. And then one day, I saw on the community Slack channel there were some small grants available.
The idea there is really to create a grant that's more accessible, that provides proof of concept without providing this huge administrative barrier to getting funding. So the program itself is basically up to £3,000 that will be granted to multiple projects over the next 2 years, over multiple application rounds. What we really aim to do is create access to funding and access to the experience of grant writing for early career professionals. So we don't set any specific thematic requirements for what the microfinance applicants can do. They can do anything related to any type of GGR, any method of engaging, whether that's creative, whether that's scientific. We just want to promote multidisciplinary and collaborative projects.
£3,000. It wouldn't make a dent in my machine costs, but it would go a long way to creating a few episodes of a podcast. And that seemed like exactly the type of project that they were after. Now, I could do a big cliffhanger here, but if you've been paying attention to the credits or the show notes of this podcast, you will know that, yes, we got the funding, and a big thank you to the FLN. In fact, we were the first project funded through this initiative. And not only did that mean that I could start working on this podcast, but getting that application accepted, as small as it might have seemed, it was a really big moment for me. It just felt like a real vote of confidence. The thing with confidence, though, doesn't keep the heating on. Next time, I tried to fund this whole thing. You've been listening to Grounded, a climate startup journey, a podcast from Restored. Thanks to everyone who chatted to me on this journey, whether recorded or not. And shout out to the team behind the show. Our producer and my creative partner in crime, Ben Weaver-Hinks, our graphic designer, Lyubov Pankiv, Paola Science and Jack Turnham for all their work on helping market and promote the podcast, and a special thanks to the Future Leaders Network, an initiative of CORE, for supporting this podcast. If I could ask you to do just 2 favours, please hit that follow button wherever you're listening and give us a rating because it really helps. And share this episode with a friend or a colleague who you think might like what we're doing. You can find us on restord.earth. That's restored without the second E, .earth.